Louisiana has come a long way, and we've lived through pain, plagues, and pestilences, and of those who tried to diagnose and treat them. This series of lectures is an overview, and this second section begins where we left off in the previous session. Just who were these first physicians in the colonies? France tended to treat their colonists, as we discussed in the last talk, better than the British did in their colonies. So really the French were the first to dominate healthcare in Louisiana. Now France, from which they came, was the first to place surgeons equal to physicians. Before, surgeons were felt to be of a lesser standing than physicians. Physicians were learned gentlemen, book learned and lectured, but they really didn't use their hands except for bloodletting, where surgeons were the ones who cut and did the necessary sort of bloody procedures. And of course, they were considered to be tradesmen and were of a lower class than the physicians. And their training was from war, seafaring, and from trauma, sort of hands-on experience. And they were the generalists of the day and were usually less expensive to call on with illness. France was also the first to actually establish hospitals and to treat patients and also to train those who were going to care for them. The Paris Clinical School was preeminent in training physicians. And of course, all those who went to Paris benefited by this high level of discussion and consideration and training in medicine. Now the Creoles, those who came to Louisiana and had families and had offspring, tended to send their young men abroad to be educated and trained. And Louisiana was more willing to do this because of their background than other parts of our country. In the beginning of the 19th century, French physicians were in place here. There was some Spanish, English, Scots-Irish, and Germans that came along with the people who came to settle in this territory. Americans were coming down the Mississippi River, across country and by ship, and there were definitely more coming after the Louisiana Purchase. And they were all wanting to get rich quick, including the physicians who followed them. Now, American physicians, those who were trained back east, if trained at all, were just not all that good. Those that trained abroad seemed to have more going for them. And in fact, here in this country, you could get a degree in less than 1 year. And the very first U.S. medical graduate was in 1770 back in Pennsylvania. A listing that was found and taken from a French ship that came into New Orleans in the early 1800s. This was a list of substances that were available to the surgeon upon that vessel to help the sailors and those who traveled with him. Most of which you can see were from either herbs or from plants. And what medicine had to treat these people with was a theory that desperate diseases required desperate remedies. And notable was the use of mercury, and in great quantities. And bloodletting, anywhere from a pint to 2 pints or even more. Some people talk about quarts of blood taken from people during illness. The use of quinine, of course, they knew it helped malaria, but the question was to diagnose malaria. And so any fever that came along was usually given, patients were given quinine with the thought that it might help. Whiskey, of course, was quite popular because it was cheaper than opium. And of course, we think of it today as a more of a recreational drug, but back then it was actually part of the armamentarium. And American physicians followed the English, and they really were hard at it, or what they call the anaphylagic method, because they believe strongly in bleeding, blistering, purging, vomiting, and sweating. If you remember, some of the native Indians were into this too, but this was very strong among the American physicians. Now, from about 1825 to 1860, here in Louisiana, the Creole physicians were mostly of French and Spanish extraction, and most of them had trained abroad. They had not gone east, they had actually gone to Europe to train. Now, but Americans were coming down, and American physicians, again, looking for a chance to practice and make money, they were coming down into the Louisiana territory, and particularly in the New Orleans. Now, there was a Dr. Charles A. Lutzenberg who believed in the abortive treatment method, and of course he was unique because he tried to stay away from the purgatives, and particularly calomel, which was mercury. But he bled his patients excessively, and that is until the fever vanquished or the patient died. And the public had to choose treatments by choosing the physician. And of course, again, if you remember, desperate diseases required desperate measures. And an English politician writing back in this time said that English physicians will kill you, but the French will let you die. Louisiana was felt to be epidemic prone. I mean, that was the word that went out to anybody who was coming here for business or for whatever reason. And plagues seemed to be related to bringing these new immigrants in who were coming from abroad, visitors from wherever they were coming, from brokers, merchants, seamen. Everybody was blamed for whatever came into a community. And sometimes it was true, with those who coming in being sickly. And it also was impacted by economic, social, and sanitary issues that were here, particularly in New Orleans at the time. Cisterns, if you know what a cistern is, the big wooden structures that contained water that ran from the roofs, was the only safe water to drink. Streets were used as sewers, particularly in New Orleans. And of course, there were insects everywhere. And there was also what was considered the sickly season, which was usually the summer months until it became cool in the fall. And those people who could got out of town, so to speak. They came upriver, went to the Gulf Coast to just get away from particularly New Orleans. And there was all sorts of reasons that physicians put forth for illness. And it was the sickly season, long moss, wherever there was long moss, humidity, dampness, and then some just said it's Louisiana. If you got sick, it's just Louisiana. Again, this shows Charity Hospital, and I think it's important to note that in the years between 1850 and 1852, admissions to Charity Hospital ran over 18,000 patients within a year. And of this 18,000, only 2,000 were patients that were American born. And of these, no more than 250 out of the 18,000 were native Louisianians. So it just showed these people who were pouring off of vessels coming by boat down the river from abroad, walking and coming along the southern trails into Louisiana were the ones who were really arriving here, getting sick and requiring health care. The sort of pestilence or the epidemics that impacted Louisiana, these were the notable ones. We spoke somewhat under the natives, Americans who died from smallpox. There was always malaria. There were epidemics of measles, of diphtheria, influenza. And two of the major ones I wish to discuss now are yellow fever and cholera. Now, it was called many things, the black vomit, yellow jack, bronze John, but yellow fever was to impact New Orleans and Louisiana. And then even up the East Coast, there were epidemics there, and particularly up the Mississippi River Valley. But I'm direct my discussions to New Orleans in particular. The blacks and the Creoles who lived here seemed to be somewhat immune to yellow fever, whereas the sickness completely depleted the American and European populations, who were particularly dangerous. It was particularly dangerous to these newcomers and recent arrivals to the area. Now, most New Orleanians left the city June through October and returned beginning in November. American physicians considered their French colleagues old-fashioned, unenterprising, and usually ineffective. But if the French practitioners seldom cured their patients, the American physicians often killed theirs. American doctors tended to rely on the mercury, bloodletting, and to battle nature. They believed if a small dose of medication helped, a stronger dose would be sure to cure him. Patients themselves encouraged this attitude. They tended to regard a prudent physician as indecisive and a reckless one as bold and courageous. The epidemic of 1853 resulted because so many people were rendered helpless by its attack that it did crystallize the Southern health movement and was the direct reason for the formation of a state board of health in Louisiana and in New Orleans, and was actually the first in the nation to be established. The Howard Association that I mentioned earlier was a group of young businessmen who volunteered to offer money and time to the caring of the sick of the city. And it was really unique in all of America. And it started in 1837, but by the epidemic of 1853, there were over 60 members. And what they did was to pay physicians to care for people. They also bought medications to treat all the citizens with, whether they were free or slave, could afford health care or not. It was brought to everyone. And again, from their effort, the State Board of Health was formed to try to answer this. It was the first in the nation. And it's interesting that when they formed these boards of health, they did not want to include physicians. So there was usually lay members. They were, I think, afraid that physicians would derail what they were trying to do, because you had doctors on both sides of whether to quarantine or not quarantine, whether it was an infectious thing or some sort of poison. And it was all this not being sure about it, and they thought it was just better to get the physicians out of the picture altogether. The epidemic in 1878 spread all the way up the Mississippi River Valley, and there are books written on this, particularly in the Memphis area. But New Orleans had some 27,000 cases, and everybody left the city. And of course, leaving the city impacted the economics. So this is why some papers refused to report, so that people wouldn't leave. So it was all word of mouth to get people out of town, because there were those who were afraid they were going to lose business. Of course, whole businesses were wiped out because all the employees died from yellow fever. Whole families did. And during this time of interest, some 23 physicians died. 10 were in New Orleans, and the rest were upriver and on the North Shore. And of this number were 4 volunteers who had come to Louisiana to help out, including one doctor, Dr. Owens from Chicago, who was a female, who came to help but died. The next big disease to come through Louisiana, and was particularly really impact the population in its numbers, was cholera. It's a bacterial infection causing profound and acute onset of uncontrolled diarrhea, or what was called rice water stool, which soiled everything and, of course, spread the illness to anybody who handled any of the stool or the infected clothing. The fluid loss is so profound because it's a gallon or more an hour. So within an hour, within a day, people could be dead, just dying from shock. Epidemic began in 1816 in Asia, and then went into New York and was in New Orleans by 1832. It was particularly bad and hard on children, older adults, and those with any chronic disease, and particularly with the slave population. It was reported to have completely devastated some plantations of their slaves. One below New Orleans lost 83 out of 100 slaves, all within a matter of a day or two. And we know now it's a failure in sanitation and proper food preparation. In 1882, arrived in New Orleans. They know how it came. It came aboard a particular ship. Some 15,000 patients, once it was identified on that day, immediately left the city. There were 2,000 deaths in 2 weeks, and a total of 4,342 died at that time in a population of 35,000. If you remember, in 1853, the population was then 1,500. 150,000. So you can see the growth in the population from 1832 to 1853. Everyone were confronted with misery and death, and so much of it depended upon immunity of the human body, those who could withstand it and those that couldn't. And of course, that was true of both yellow fever and in some instances, other diseases such as smallpox. It was usually the children who suffered. But as mentioned before, vaccinations were at hand for those who could afford it, and if it was available at all, could protect it. Tuberculosis seemed to be not as aggressive in Europeans as it was in the Africans, because it was not in Africa, but it was in Europe. So the people from Europe tended to get it localized, particularly into one part of their body, whereas those like the native Indians, the Africans, and even later the natives of Alaska were known to be just overcome by tuberculosis. So they had tubercular meningitis. It went into their bones, went all over their body. It was miliary. And I think it was interesting that a Dr. Cartwright, who started his practice in Natchez and then brought it to New Orleans, recommended what was felt to be the sugar house cure for tuberculosis, because he found that slaves who worked in the sugar mills where they made sugar tended to not have as serious disease as those who didn't. And also, being involved in camellias, I found that one of the great collectors of camellias in the South Carolina area came from Europe to run the plantation of his family when his older brother died, and he had active TB that he had. And the doctor who cared for him there in Charleston told him that if he was going to live, he had to work in the dirt. He had to be exposed to raw dirt. So that's why he started planting camellias, he and a young African-American slave. And he survived and lived to be 80 years old. I think it's interesting, of course, in the sugar house with the grinding of the sugar, there's a lot of dirt and dust that's in the air there. And it's interesting to note that what came about to treat tuberculosis in the 1940s was streptomycin. And streptomycin comes from a fungus that is in earth and dirt. So in some cases, the slaves, having worked in the dirt, they were actually protected or treated to make their disease not so overwhelming. What they did find out, physicians did, that typhoid fever, you best leave that alone. You try to treat anybody, you're not going to win. They're going to die. And of course, malaria was a long continued fever, and that's where quinine was used for those when it was recognized, but no one knew the dose or how much to give or anything else. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. There were other infections, particularly respiratory, diphtheria, dysentery, fever. And of course, the businessmen, the politicians, and the media always played down epidemics, particularly when they started and until there were dead bodies everywhere. So because they wanted to hold back and prevent the loss of citizens going out of the city and going elsewhere in the loss of business. Dr. James William Dupree, one of a number of physicians I'll discuss in this presentation, was a leading public health figure. I mentioned him just a few slides back. He was from Point Capee Parish, came to Baton Rouge in 1863. and was a health officer during the great epidemic in 1878, and was the first president of the Baton Rouge Board of Health. He was a medical officer for the university located here in Baton Rouge, was a leading authority on yellow fever, and was the first to study the mosquito as a possible vector. And notable was he was the first vice president of the LSMS and was the second president from 1879 to 1880. And as a health officer, he reported that Baton Rouge was a mess. The only efforts at sanitation worth mentioning was that being at the Meyer Hotel in St. Joseph's Academy, which is still here today. So as mentioned, life in Louisiana was always threatened, and epidemics were rampant. The life for slaves were hard and tragic, but they had more treatment that was available at the time because of their value on plantations. Competition was intense between city and rural physicians. Most of the city doctors envied the rural physicians because they could work with the plantation and be able to have payment, where the city was really beholding patient to patient. The first managed care contracts in the country, in the United States, were on plantations. And it was relationships between the planter and a physician. And of course, they only got paid when the crop came in. If it wasn't a good crop, the doctor might not get paid. But they actually were paid as managed care. In the New Orleans, benevolent societies came up. People would pay into it. And then the benevolent society would contract with the doctor to care for their patients. So much like an HMO today. And they covered their drugs and even burial. Again, the doctors hated this because they had to negotiate with these benevolent societies. But you can see 4 out of 5 citizens belonged to these societies. So doctors practicing in New Orleans had to deal with it. And there were many cures that were attempted on slaves that were not on whites. And it wasn't because of any bad things, but the slaves were of such value. Anything was done to try to save their life. Whereas as far as the white goes, c'est la vie. You could always find another wife up the river or down the river. Now this is kind of early, but it shows what a doctor was doing on a plantation. Bled a Negro, medicine to a Negress, and what he gave her, bled the same one on the same day. So these were charges that he made. On the 22nd, he just visited the plantation, but then on the 23rd, he gave medicine to one of the slaves, gave the dose. He bled another, went to see someone and bled him, and then gave the same patient that he was treating on the 14th a purge, and again, he added up and sent his bill in. Many physicians thought that Africans were different physiologically, and of course now we know they're not. But back then they believed that what was true for them was different than what was true for white people. And they felt that they could withstand heat and could perspire differently and all this stuff. Well, we know now that if any human can acclimatize to temperature, but of course they had no alternative. They were working out in it, and they certainly would tend to tolerate it better. The slaves had a strong spiritual belief, and that's why the churches and religion meant so much to them, and it tied also them to nature. They believed everything was combined, and they mixed their belief with others, and they even had among them conjurers, and of course they could curses, and they believed in magic and all these things that would impact them. They had some immunity to disease. They seemed as though they could tolerate yellow fever better, could not tolerate cholera, but also malaria tended to be, they were somewhat resistant to, and we'll discuss that in a slide or two. They lived in closed communities. and many died despite whatever care they were given. They were usually treated by the overseer or the mistress, who had to use a cookbook following symptoms to hopefully arrive at a diagnosis and know what to do. So they were usually treating symptoms and didn't have a diagnosis unless it was by word of mouth or by brought up by a steamboat or from a paper, or if they called a doctor who was seeing other patients who could tell them what they were dealing with. A typical drug order, and 10 gallons of castor oil, a bottle of laudanum, that's a narcotic, an ounce of opium, again a narcotic, Paragard, Ipecac, Hartshorn, that's actually horn of deer, that was used for diarrhea, quinine, tartar, calomel, sweet mercury, Epsom salt, and then also they ordered lancets, though most of them knew that bleeding an African was not a good idea. Most of these, they did not tolerate bloodletting very often because they were already anemic and very often malnourished. A hospital, almost every plantation had a hospital or a sick house, was where if a worker was sick and could not report to work, because if he was not on duty, he runs the risk of being punished. He had to report, like sick call, and either they came to the big house and reported to the master and to the mistress that they were sick and had a problem and didn't think they could work that day, or they were sent there by the overseer when the slave reported that they were in problem, didn't feel well. So the mistress was very often responsible for the health care of everyone, including her own children. And she used everything, medical books, recipes, clipping from newspapers, and family traditions. One of the very first and most popular was the Planters and Mariners Medical Companion by Dr. James Ewald from Charleston. A word about malaria impacted everyone, but it had to feed on an infective host. It was carried in the salivary glands. Female mosquitoes were the only ones who would bite you. The males fed on plant nectar, but the females would seek a blood meal, and they preferred to feed at night, beginning their search at dusk, and then through the night finding a blood source. It's a parasite, and they eat the red cells. Begins 8 to 25 days after a bite, cyclic pattern to the fever, causing shivers and rigors, joints hurting, vomiting, of course a drop in the blood count because they're actually hemolyzing and eating the cells. Some people would get jaundice, and then they would void blood in their urine, which was called black water. Once you get it, it very often goes to sleep in your body and wakes up, and so it relapses or recrudescence. No one knew how long to treat it. They would just treat it until the symptoms went away, and that was quinine, if they could decide that's what it was. But very often they would get reinfection, particularly if they had no actual immunity. What made the Africans unique was that they had sickle cell trait, they had Duffy antigens, which we know about now because of blood transfusions, and they also tended to have glucose 6-phosphate, G6PD deficiency. And because they had that tendency, this made their red cells more resistant to the parasite eating it. And this was not and sort of unique to Africans or those of African descent. Also of interest was that what was felt to impact the health of everyone across the South was the infestation of hookworms. And of course people went barefooted, and this was a source of hookworm. Also of interest was pica, and pica is even existing today, but it had to be a particular of interest. I think people now, pica is eating ice all the time, but back then there were certain clays that they dug, and it was almost an inherited, it was sort of like mother-daughter families that did this. It was so severe that It was reported by Dr. Carpenter in an 1844 article in the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal, which is now the LSMS Journal, on the subject of pica, that it was most common in many sections of Louisiana and caused at times abandonment of whole plantations. And of course, with eating the clay, if it was near a house that had been painted, very often it was a source of lead poisoning. Civil War medicine. This brought about a great change in the health and the care of our country. It impacted our country in many ways, but particularly I'm going to talk in regards to the impact that medicine had. There was a mobilization of large masses of men, which facilitated the rapid spread of communicable diseases. There were more soldiers to die from disease than died from bullets and from the trauma of war. Most of the Southern recruits came from rural areas and were totally unimmune and free from many childhood diseases, which then they caught or came in contact with in the camps or where these men came together. Measles, scarlet fever, mumps just quickly spread through these camps on both the north and the south. Diarrhea, dysentery, and malarial fevers, plus many other types of fever, were always present in the south and spread more widely under unsanitary conditions of military life. At the time of the Civil War, there was no planning in regards to military medicine. The two medical schools in New Orleans, which I will discuss more next time, that were present in New Orleans, were open at the time, were declared. Once war was declared, they emptied their student bodies to enter the uniformed services, and the schools were closed. Many of the faculty joined the Army. So whatever semblance of training of physicians, particularly in the South, came to a halt with the beginning of hostility. At the beginning, on both sides, the number of injuries that occurred overwhelmed both sides. There was no way to handle the wounded. There was no ambulance service. There was no responsibility other than one soldier to take care of another. However, the South seemed somewhat more ready. They actually ended up with more trained leaders than the North had at the very beginning. And Dr. Samuel Preston Moore was really was in charge of the medical corps for the Confederacy and was a very exceptional man. The North was really behind. They were still in the Mexican War, which was in 1846, and all the generals were all the medical doctors in charge of health care for the North were outdated, and they were just not ready for it. Now, Dr. William Hamilton came in. Man was brilliant. He ended up being a neurosurgeon afterwards. But he changed all that. But of interest, he tried to take mercury out of the satchels that the doctors had in the Union Army to treat the soldiers. And because he wanted them to take mercury out, he lost his job. The seriously wounded laid on the battlefield for days until death came to them or their family came and rescued them. And the disease killed more than missiles. Sanitation was very poor, and everybody had to forage for food. It was not supplied by both initially by the Union nor by the South. Now, what came later was that rations were furnished to soldiers. Ambulances came about to move the wounded. There were methods of triage that was developed, particularly by Dr. Letterman. There's a military hospital named after him. But he was a very remarkable sort of an emergency type doctor who brought about triaging. This is on the northern side. There were battle-side surgical units that came about. Hospitals were established, usually along the train lines through the South when the train still ran. But again, all these had to be built. Improved public health, food and its preparation, sanitation, camps with showers and clean clothes, dealing with all the vermin that usually came from people living together. And really a radical change in military medicine, which still impacts today in the care of soldiers.